Isabel, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is going to be a lot of fun, very interesting, I'm sure. Great to chat with you. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ben. And it's lovely to see you again. And I'm dialing in, I guess, or tuning in from Vancouver, Canada, which is the territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish
Hmm.
First Nations. They've been here
Hmm.
since time and eternity.
Yeah, great. Interesting. I didn't know that. I think that's a really interesting factoid for my listeners as well. So maybe we can get into some of that when we dive into the conversation. Yeah. Before we do any of that, I think it'd be really useful to just have you paint a picture around your background, who you are, what you do, how you got into doing what you do. And I say this to all of my guests, which is take as much time as you think you need to answer that question.
Okay, great. Well, again, my name is Isobel O'Connell, and I'm an ESG and sustainability practitioner. I've worked in Canada. I've worked overseas in the Middle East, in South America. A long time ago, I worked in Russia, and I've worked a bit in Europe. And I started out in community economic development, working with decimated communities from due to the forestry sector here in British Columbia. And then I moved more into a corporate role, working for two global consulting agencies supporting and building their sustainability and climate change practices. And then I moved into more in-house roles, and those in-house roles ranged from working for oil and gas to working for an infrastructure port operator and working most recently with an energy company as well that's being built here in British Columbia. And in those roles, I mainly focused on the social side of sustainability,
Hmm.
but I do have a keen interest in ESG and investment and asset management and how the environment, social, and governance, the three buckets, as I call them, for ESG, how they interplay and work together and support companies in their investment decisions and also more on their internal engagement areas within the company as well. I have a bachelor's degree in geography, a master's degree in public policy, and most recently I did become a certified investor relations officer through CIRI, Canadian Investor Relations Association.
Really interesting background. And how did you get to be doing what you do?
I think I've always been interested in working with stakeholders, working with whether it's a community or whether it's internally with executives as a community. But I think what's really drove me was the fact that, there is the strategic angle of working with stakeholders and ensuring that not only their message is heard, but their message is also integrated into decision making, into long term planning, into crisis management, into scenario planning, all of those good things. So, really, that's what sort of is big umbrella. But I started out, as I said, in community economic development, and that's where the conversation started for me around sustainability. Okay, how can we, corporation, government, address environment issues better, social issues better? And finally, with the ESG space, the governance, which is where the decision making comes in. And that's taken a while in the area of CSR, sustainability, to get to that G point. And ESG does bring that in. It gives a framework to the environment and the social, or even a foundation. And that's very helpful in the decision making side of what I do as a practitioner in ESG, whether it's working in house or working as a consultant. So,
Was there a moment when you were studying or maybe growing up or maybe in your early career where there was a corporate challenge, scandal, something? I remember when I was in university, there was a big thing around Shell in Nigeria when I was a student. And I thought, well, that's interesting, that there's a lot of interesting things that are coming together. And and it just caught my attention, and I don't think it was a direct influence, but we all see things in the news that we're like, huh, how did that happen? Was there a moment like that where you thought, this is an interesting field because, geez, these guys, they don't have this all figured out, and this might be an area where I could put a little bit more of my curiosity or effort into.
Well, the list is kind of endless for me, but I'll
Hmm.
take you back a bit because I think we're from
Hmm.
the same era as well, then almost.
Hmm.
Um, so the first one was probably for me was the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. I grew up in Victoria, British Columbia, so we woke up, my family and I, one morning to ash being all over the outside of our house. Um, and on the car and in the street. And I remember getting a day off school because of that,
Hmm.
because there was so much ash that had come floated over from Washington State to my home in Vancouver
Hmm.
Island at that time. So that was a first. And then, of course, too, there was the Chernobyl disaster
Hmm.
because I was in Russia in a place called Patiret, and that
Hmm.
was which is now Ukraine. Pardon me, I should say
Hmm.
that. But that's when a reactor basically blew up, and it just decimated because there was a meltdown that whole city, and now that city is no longer. They've never cleaned it up properly,
Hmm.
and of course, there was all the ramifications from that, whether it's mental health, uh, physical health, the children. So that was another one. Then the Exxon in 1989, this is the Exxon
Hmm. Hmm.
Valdez spill. And that was, well, that was it was Exxon, the company. And it was a tanker that was bound for Long Beach, California. It came from Alaska where they drill for oil.
Hmm.
And yeah, what was it? 10.8 million gallons of oil seeped into
Hmm.
Williams Sound. And of course, there was a moratorium for 30 years, but that
Hmm.
30 years went really fast. So I remember in 2019, it was like, wow, that was that was a
Hmm.
bit concerning because there's still the ramifications of that, the wildlife, whether it's seals, orca
Hmm.
whales, and of course kelp, all sorts of things in that regard in the marine life. And then I guess there is just one more, and this was in 1982, and it was in Newfoundland, and I can't remember the name of the company it was, but it was offshore drilling because there is some offshore drilling in the east coast of Canada, and this was interesting because it was an offshore drilling um, apparatus that was in the middle of the ocean, and a big wave knocked it over. The whole, um, rig. I get not apparatus, rig.
Hmm.
I mean, it was a proper rig, and 84 crew members died. 15 survived, and that was and I cannot remember the name of the company. I'd have to rack my
Hmm.
brain a bit, but I remember thinking, "Gosh, we are so." And that was I was about 7 then. Gosh, we are so vulnerable
Hmm.
as human beings, not just
Hmm.
in to be at the receiving end of that accident, but in the way of company and government planning, because there was
Right.
none. In all of
Hmm.
these situations, there was none that happened. I mean, it just didn't. And the fact with Exxon Valdez, in Williams Sound, that was a reef. It just collided with a reef. It was almost like a Titanic for the oil and gas industry.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There were a few more while you were talking as well. I was thinking about a few. I was thinking about the 3 Mile Island uh, disaster. It wasn't a disaster. I think they locked it down before it got really bad. But that was one that was. I grew up in southern Ontario, and that was not too far away. And every time, and this is every November, I always think of the Gordon Lightfoot song about the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's always seems to come. So all these things they do. It's because they do leave an imprint. I think that what we're saying, they leave an imprint. They're obviously there's immediate impacts and there are wider societal impacts. They say 30-year moratorium, and then they become part of there's a cultural element too. And so the interaction, it's an interesting area because the interaction with companies and the environment and society has been there for a long time. But this is quite an evolving space too, rapidly evolving space. So it's an interesting area, right? It's an interesting area career wise.
And then, I mean, there's the interesting one, and I'll just go right for the jugular right
Yeah.
now because I know we've
Okay.
discussed this on a few occasions, is the Yukon Gorge and the Pilbara in Australia with Rio Tinto.
Mm,
The well, the destruction. I won't call it an explosion. The destruction of the caves of the indigenous people who had
mhm,
been residing there again since time and eternity. Very similar to Canada and Australia with the indigenous piece.
mhm,
And really, it came down to poor decision making, due diligence quality, why that happened. And, you know, the impact assessment hadn't properly been undertaken.
mm,
And that happened in May 2022. Yeah, no, May 2020. That's when it happened. And it was again Rio Tinto. It was the Brockman mine that Rio Tinto owns in that area. And they've owned it
mhm,
for many decades and they've mined in that area. But that one issue, that one crisis, destruction
mhm,
that caused a ripple effect throughout the mining industry because, as we all know, colonialism plays a huge role in countries such as Canada and Australia
mm,
and the aftermath of that. And that was a huge, no pun intended, blow for not only the Indigenous people, but all the people who have worked with the Indigenous people to support reconciliation, whether they're government, working
mm,
in industry, or working in more civil society organizations. It really was a huge
mm,
setback in how they move forward in their relationship. Now things have been, I wouldn't say resolved, but certainly been discussed and addressed. Rio Tinto has been very clear that it was their fault that this took place. They
mm,
were good at did some very good public relations, and that has helped them. Um,
mhm,
but at the same time, I don't think their share price went down, um,
mm,
and I don't think you know, eh, their decision making process has changed that much. Yes, they've done a bit
mm,
more on the community and social performance side, but I think the board is still making the same kind of the
mm,
same sort of decision making process in place as their executives. So there's a challenging environment there around decision making when you, as a company, yes, you have a strong board, yes, you have strong executives, yes, you have strong
mhm,
teams out in the field, and of course, strong relationships with, let's say, government. But at the same time, the shareholder can be like, well,
mm,
that's all wonderful, but the
mm,
price of the share is the most important thing. And that can be what drives, ESG or hinders
mhm,
ESG in many respects.
mhm.
And the movement toward that. That's why the importance around the governance piece is so important. But 40,000 years of history were destructed in the space of, I think it was 15 to 33 minutes.
Wow. Uh, And we've had a a brief chat about that as well. And one of the things that when you described that, and as you were talking there, I'm just wondering how something like that happens in an organization like Rio Tinto, who has we can zoom out, but let me just dive into this one just as a maybe illustrate some of these things, because we you talk about Exxon Valdez, and that was a long time, now a long time ago, and so much has changed, evolved, but so much maybe hasn't, is also the
Mhm.
reaction I get, because there have been all these standards and regulations and practices and things that have been developed. And maybe you hit the nail on the head with the comment about boards and executives and shareholders. But I'm wondering how, and this is Rio Tinto, as far as I'm aware, in the extractive industry, is one of the biggest in mining and one of the most experienced, and probably adheres to all types of the leading practices in this area, I would have thought. And yet something like this still happens. And so how could that happen? How could that be? And,
Yeah,
and kind of put you on the spot because you're not there, right? You're not in the in that exact context. So I don't want to, but what more broadly is just how could something like that happen in an organization that has standards and that has processes, procedures, has stakeholders that have their eyes on it, that have people trained, and all of these leading edge things, and yet something like that still happens. How is that the case? How could that possibly be? Is what immediately comes up. So it's just more, yeah. Some of your thoughts would be interesting to explore.
I think it's an excellent topic and question, and it's a complicated one. I think what happened here was it was a well-known fact that they did get a license, a compliance. They met the regulations of the Australian government,
Hmm.
and they went a little bit further, and they being Rio Tinto, and got another license. But the impact assessment, and it was specifically the archaeological study, showed that the area was far richer in not just mineral that they
Hmm.
were the ore that they were wanting to get. That's Rio Tinto, but
Hmm.
in the history for the indigenous people, and the indigenous people were engaged in that process, and they were adamant that yes, this is a sacred area, and still went ahead. They still went ahead. So I think what happened there was, and this is me again, just you know,
Hmm.
not pulling something out of my head, being very thoughtful. It's communicating between the various parties, because
Hmm.
sometimes these companies are working with multiple levels of government, so multiple compliance and regulation issues,
Hmm.
often not aligned, or in very new areas, where geography areas where there just hasn't been a mega project that's been built. Or, in this case, yes, the mine had been there for decades, but at the same time, it was a bit of a business as usual when it was,
Hmm.
well, hold it, after this archaeological study, this is business unusual. So the
Hmm.
decision making process, I think this is where we talk about the focus, but maybe there was that piece around the uncertainty piece that needed to be delved into a bit more.
Hmm.
Um, Also, too, on the decision making side, I hear this. It happened during what was a kind of public holiday time in Australia. So maybe they're just, the commands went out, the plans were in
Hmm.
place, but the leadership maybe weren't as available on that front line as they should have been. Now, I'm not putting down operational leadership. They're very strong, they deliver, but at the same time, there is that need to often refer back to the higher, the executive level leadership within a company, and build out that scenario plan. Um, and that will take multiple
Hmm.
um, professional inputs. Also,
Hmm.
too, when working with governments, often they're stressed and strained.
Hmm.
And when they are making a decision, often it is around just getting a certificate. And it's often more complex than just
Yeah.
getting a certificate. So I think what
Yeah.
happened there was there was maybe a lack of due diligence, so improved due diligence, which we all, in every sector and industry, we need, but also a real understanding of, okay, in the decision making process, the uncertainty, and then also to what had happened maybe on a cognitive
Hmm.
bias. Like, we've done this before. Rio
Hmm.
Tinto. Yeah, we do this. We do this all the time. We've
Hmm.
got the permit, so we can do it.
Hmm.
But we did take into
Right.
effect that the archaeological study came back with much more information, much more
Hmm.
detail, much more historic information, that is.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting to explore increasingly as I think about these challenges, sustainability and the ESG space and societal expectations of business. Increasingly, I come to the conclusion that good quality decision making is, more important than ever. And in fact, sometimes all of these standards and regulations and procedures and things can get in the way or provide a false sense of security that they maybe remove some thinking and some questions that should be asked at certain points that just aren't asked because they default to, well, we've got the permit, or this process will handle that, or something along those lines.
Yeah. And sometimes those need to be looked at far more carefully. And if they've not been in place, those decision-making processes, I mean, I noticed this when I came back to Canada, mega projects
Mm,
hadn't been in place in Canada yet for a while. We hadn't had one built, but then we're having 4 or 5 of them built in British Columbia, all of them very unique as well, these infrastructure
mm,
projects. And there is that need for the stronger, intergovernmental relations and inter-stakeholder
hmm
relations. And in particular, when dealing with diverse stakeholders, whether they be Indigenous people to more civil society, and realizing too that these individual groups, stakeholder groups, that is, some of them have to be considered as partners. And I think that was something that didn't
mm,
happen in, the Yukon Gorge, and with the Pilbara and the explosion.
mm,
I think there was this understanding that, oh, we've done the stakeholder engagement, or maybe we didn't do it
mm,
particularly well, but we didn't empower our stakeholders to be partners in this
mm.
decision making process.
Yeah, that's an interesting lesson as well about the actually getting the input. I talk a lot about cognitive diversity, and just getting it's more than just, I think, communicating what the project is going to be about. Is actually, as you say, partnership. And partnership means genuinely listening and developing and creating spaces for that to occur. And anyway, it's interesting. We don't know exactly what happened, but you can kind of maybe
No,
imagine that maybe it's a bunch of engineers speaking scientifically, or in engineering. I don't know, but you can see how that could happen. I know that that's happened in other contexts in this sphere, but a genuine partnership, I think, involves listening and speaking in a way that that all the partners kind of understand, using a language that's common and it's understood, and all of that stuff.
exactly. Yeah, no, and then of course too, I mean, it doesn't have to be in the boardroom. It can be at kitchen tables. I've gone into homes
Mm,
throughout the world and had
hmm
conversations about major infrastructure projects that are either well underway in their operations, or going to be enhanced, or need to be built, or are being built,
yeah,
that continuous.
yeah.
Because it's really important now, especially in the area of social performance that I work in.
Mm,
Originally, way back in the day, it was build the site, then do the public relations piece.
right,
Now it's no, no,
right,
do the public relations piece up front and
right,
then build the site. Don't put
right.
anything, a stake in the ground until you've got all your stakeholders, understanding, in alignment. I can't say agreeing, but definitely in alignment
Mm,
and
mm.
informed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to go back to that. I want to get some of your stories from time in the field. But before we do that, I want to maybe spend a little bit of time on just some of these terms. So
Yes.
ESG versus sustainability. What is it? What does it actually mean? I see ESG and sustainability being used interchangeably an awful lot, and they're different. And one of the problems I have with ESG is that it's used as a catch-all for all of this stuff, but actually there's so much in each of these three buckets, and that can create interesting conversations and misunderstandings. So could we just
Mhm.
dive into these? So sustainability, ESG, what's the difference? That would be a useful place to spend a little bit of time.
Great. Yeah. I mean, on a on a personal level, I'm a polymath, so I often work across strategy. I've even worked with organizational psychologists, and I've even recently done technology adaptation as well. I mean, that's the ESG space, the environment, social, and governance. So it's kind of been an exciting transition from working in sustainability, but the focus is always on investment. But let me backtrack a bit. The term ESG is actually not a new one. It's been around since about 2004, and it came from a UN report called Who Cares Wins. And it was a guidance that was brought out by the UN Global Compact, which the UN Global Compact was like a sustainability foundation going forward. It was like the starting
Mm,
place that companies could write pledges and sign their pledge to be
Mm.
more sustainable. And they have a series of clauses that companies can use to start and build on their sustainability journey. But I think what's very interesting is that, and often overlooked, is that ESG in that report, there was that connecting of financial markets to the changing world. So there, it
Mm.
was sort of a bit looking for ahead of the game, saying, okay, yes, it's wonderful to be a good corporate citizen and to be philanthropic and to be
Hmm.
engaged in the community, but one has to be, as a company, engaged in the market and in the financial market specifically, and that need for guidance from the financial side on how to be more sustainable. So ESG it's not really a niche concept. It's often sold as that, but it's a framework, and it's a framework for, I'm going to say a bad word right now, risk management,
Okay.
and but I like to think of it as more strategic
Mm.
growth and value creation.
Hmm.
I like to be really positive because risk has a negative
Hmm.
connotation to it.
Hmm.
I think it's, there's the opportunity side. And
Hmm.
really, ESG, it's very quantitative and it's externally regulated. There has to be regulations and that has to be considered. And that's that important piece, the G piece, because the environment, the E and the S, very important. But the grounding piece is that G. So think about it as a house. You've got two poles and you've got the foundation, which is the G, the governance. And then also too, there's the ESG is they look at the measurable goals. There's a lot of information about data and companies needing data
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
support decision, not drive decision. I mean, they're talking a lot about the public about data driven decisions, but I think it's data
Hmm.
supported decisions.
Hmm.
And that's, very important because previously, and I'm going to bring up another term now, CSR, corporate social responsibility, that was more qualitative. It was more self
Okay.
regulated for companies to approach their ethical
Hmm.
practices. But that looked at social contributions and the commitment to both society and in the environment, but often there was no governance in place. Some companies had some policies, some companies had some procedures. In some geographic locations, there was
Hmm.
compliance and regulation in place. The UK, where you live, has been far further ahead than North America or some of these other locations that I've been in the world. But really, there's the difference between the two, ESG and CSR. But from a practitioner point of view, what I have found is
Hmm.
when I've worked within a company and also as a consultant, it's almost like on my side of the ESG or CSR or even sustainability, another term, I have influenced so much in the company, but I've never owned.
Okay. Right.
And that's where, sometimes there is a bit of an unstableness in the profession, especially when one is working alone in an organization. One can influence decisions if they're lucky, but maybe not
Hmm.
even at the right level. But I've also found too where really I've just been program managing, and
Mm.
sometimes at the whims of other people in companies, what their preferences are, whether it
Mm.
is community investment or whether it's a major environmental
Mm.
issue. But the sustainability piece, I think, just wrapping this up, that's really
Mhm.
interesting. So we've got the three terms: we've got
Mhm.
ESG, CSR, and sustainability. And I see sustainability as being the umbrella because actually a Latin term, which is sustain, and it's sustenere, is the Latin term, which means to sustain. And it's a term that was made popular in Saxon times by the accountant Karl von Karlowitz.
Okay.
Interesting name. And he wrote about forestry management and the need to balance between harvesting old trees and ensuring enough new trees were um, able to
Mm.
replace them. And he brought in
Right.
that term sustainer. But so
Mm.
sustainability is a more holistic approach because it brings in the qualitative and the quantitative approaches.
Mhm.
And both are both self and externally regulated. So sustainability, it implements and is committed to a combination of CSR and ESG. And
Mm.
like I said, it's the umbrella of the two. And business really does need to have both of those practices, CSR and ESG, in place. So,
Hmm.
yeah, very interesting. But I recently came across that information about Karl von Karlowitz, the
Hmm.
economist who coined the term initially. It
Yeah,
wasn't the
it's a
Brundtland Commission back in, in
okay.
the 1990s. Yeah,
That's actually a very interesting uh, origin story because it makes a lot of sense, right? And I like that image as well because you want to harvest the trees, but also keep keep growing trees so you've got more to harvest, and you can then attach that to or transfer it to all of the things that keep a business in business, right? So you've got customers, but you've got resources and products and employees, but you also have host communities and you have governments and you have wider society. And so it's all of these things that support a business to to exist. I'm going to throw something at you. Within that, it came from my conversation with Allison Taylor. So Allison Taylor is a New York University professor, and when we spoke, she talked about a, a dichotomy between this concept, and she spoke to a Columbia University law professor for her book. And I distinctly remember this because he talks about the fiduciary responsibility of businesses to shareholders and how that is at odds with, so you have an inherent conflict of interest if you have this fiduciary responsibility, and you also have some type of relationship with wider stakeholders. And I find that it seems to create some of this tension that one sees. I don't know if you have any. I threw that at you, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But it's messy, isn't it? Right? Like, and even the
it's
term
messy. And,
ESG, right?
I'm a big fan of Allison's work. I've had the pleasure of meeting her once as well. So, thank you and big shout out to Allison. um, and no, but I think that's an interesting and it is very messy concept because we focus so much on E and sometimes we focus a little bit on S, but without really understanding what each means.
Mm,
And that can be, and what our stakeholders understand them to be. And that's why the concept of a materiality assessment is so important, whether it's a
mm,
sector materiality assessment or a company or organization. They are doing their materiality assessment. And what's
mm,
made it kind of messy is materiality assessments have been so focused on, our sustainability report that we bring out annually,
mm,
company X, let's say.
mm,
But it's no,
mm,
the materiality assessment is far more dynamic and it should be supporting
mm,
strategy within the companies, operational planning.
mm,
I've seen that where, you know, as myself as a sustainability practitioner, when I've worked in the field and in some crazy locations throughout the
yeah.
world,
Mm,
and in post-conflict environments, is I have found it really useful to always have the materiality assessment or summary of it kind of in my back pocket or on my laptop or on my phone and bring up,
mm,
okay, this issue was raised.
mm,
We're seeing this as a larger issue.
right.
Can you help us, stakeholder X, give us some more information on how that can, because that could help
Mm,
initiative X, Y, and Z. So I often say, especially too, because when ESG gets a bit messy, or people say it's just so broad, especially at the board level, it's like
mm-hmm.
it's too big, it's too broad. I'm like, okay, let's think about it as pears. Let's think about pears, fruit. We've got people, we've got environment, we've got assets, we've got reputation, and we've got systems and security because there is also on the governance side with sustainability, and it's happening all across the companies now in various geographic locations, is the issue around cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. How are we managing those? And those are now considered ESG issues. They're not
Right.
just IT issues because they do affect the strategy, the well being of the operations of a company. Yeah, so I think,
Yeah.
that's where when it gets messy, it's like, okay, let's break this down a bit further.
Hmm.
And that's where it's also too where it's strategy. And I've worked in strategy. I worked with the balanced scorecard many years ago.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've always thought was actually a positive with the balanced scorecard is it's like everyone in the company should see where they sit and where they can report up on the vision side to the vision of the company.
So
ESG
just
is strategy focused.
yeah, yeah. So just you mentioned materiality assessment, and just could you just explain that? My understanding is it's where you make an assessment of what's important to you as a business, but you also make an assessment of what's important to your stakeholders. And from a decision making lens, I think that's potentially really valuable because you can spot where the trade offs are. You can understand, make sense of the messiness
Yes.
as opposed to it being just something that you do to fulfill there are regulatory requirements now in Europe around double materiality assessments, but actually if it becomes a strategic exercise, you can actually spot, you can't please all your stakeholders all of the time. That's kind of an impossible thing to do, but you can spot where the big trade-offs are, where the tough decisions are going to be for an organization. So I think that's really, really valuable. But if you could just explain a little bit more, did I describe that accurately in terms of
Yeah, the
what a
concept.
materiality assessment? Mm-hmm.
Okay, materiality assessment. It's the most important issues to your company at present. Now, there is there's materiality assessment, which has been actually it's a financial term, so it's been used in the financial world for many years. And it was
Mm-hmm.
okay. What is our most important issues from a finance angle for this company? And what are our investors saying? What are our
Mm-hmm.
asset managers saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the crux of the materiality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reporting side is interesting in sustainability and ESG because it comes from the finance people. And finance
Mm-hmm.
people do reporting really well, really well. They know the
Right.
processes, they know how to do it. So, in a way, I've always said sustainability is lucky that we had the big brother helping or big sister helping us out
Mm-hmm.
on the reporting side because, they have, yes, sustainability reporting still has a long way to go, as does ESG, but at the same time, it is good. But
Mm-hmm.
has a good foundation. But getting back to that materiality assessment, so there's that materiality assessment, the single, which is the financial. Then sustainability took it over because of the reporting side, and that came really from the GRI, the Global Reporting Index, which is often used as a framework by companies to produce their annual reports, sustainability annual reports. And that is where they started looking at sustainability issues, the environment and the social ones, mainly. And then also to looking at some of the more internal issues within the
Mm-hmm.
company. So that around the employee engagement piece.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a gamut of issues. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's something like, especially with the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which were brought out in
Mm-hmm.
2016. I mean, those are 17 goals, and there's about 168 targets in those. So a company picks a framework and they do their materiality assessment from that with the sustainability lens. Um, and often consultants will be hired to do it because it's a good one for an external
Mm-hmm.
eye to do as opposed to an internal
Mm-hmm.
eye because people can be influenced by their colleagues and departments within the
Mm-hmm.
company to put
Mm-hmm.
certain issues forward. But then now there's the issue of double materiality, and this is where ESG
Yeah.
really, I think, comes into play. Is okay, finance and sustainability coming together and doing materiality assessments together and really focusing. And this is a struggle I think that people have challenged with transitioning from sustainability to
Mm.
ESG is ESG is strategy focused. It comes from the
Yeah.
top. Sustainability
Yeah.
has always come from the ground up,
Mm.
especially on the stakeholder side. On the ESG side, it is the investor. That's what we're moving toward. And that's where the board has come into play. And it's been a great benefit for sustainability to have finally be at a topic or even have a seat at the boardroom to serve the company,
Mm.
to serve the board. But the challenge has been is like, yes, stakeholders are important, but in the end, it's the investor that drives
Mm-hmm.
what the direction we need to go in the company to
Mm-hmm.
support sustainability. And yes, we take into account what our stakeholders are saying, but really the board is there for for the company and for the
Mm-hmm.
investor. and the investor has a bigger voice now in
Hmm.
sustainability, and or yeah, in sustainability with the ESG lens. But it does get, really messy, because
Yeah.
there is that still a lack of understanding around materiality and the, which level of materiality a company wants to take on. And
Hmm.
sometimes it is starting small and always keeping that materiality assessment live, making it available, and also ranking issues. Because, as you said in your earlier comment, one issue can be more important than the other. Let's say,
Hmm.
yeah, and there has been a lot of focus on the environment side, especially
Hmm.
in the extractive industries, but now the social side is coming into play. There is that social license to operate, especially when
Hmm.
communities our companies are building operation sites in communities, or the rise of social media, and ESG has taken
Hmm.
that into place. There is this whole digital world that is a community in and of its own, and
Hmm.
the rise of what influencers can say and do around not only issues, but also brands and products as well. And that can affect uh, a larger company, let's say like a Rio or a Glencore.
Hmm.
That can have an effect on them for sure. And of course, too, there's on the stakeholder side, and it's always a stakeholder group that I think, you know, is a bit of a mystery, is the youth, engaging
Hmm.
youth. It's always been a
Hmm.
challenge, and bringing them into the decision making process. And that means, okay, bringing them in, not just at a really community level, but bringing them in at a very strategic level.
Hmm.
Because without sounding cliche, they are the future. And,
Hmm.
but often they're given very misinformed information.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
think you're describing a very important and strategic exercise. I don't know if that's how it's commonly practiced, and but
exactly.
I do think so. For for example, the there's so many things in the E, there's so many things in the S, there's so many things in the G. They don't all coincide. They're actually inherent contradictions, right? So you could have you could be reducing your carbon footprint by moving to electric vehicles. For instance, in your I worked for a telecoms company, and that electrified their fleet. But then if those electric vehicles are the rare earths that go into the lithium batteries are being mined using forced labor or something like that, there's an inherent contradiction in certain areas. And so I'll throw another word at you as well. So your decision making is about spotting those trade-offs, and the root of to decide, decidere, is a Latin word, and what that means is to cut off. Right, so you're actively cutting off options. So you're choosing also not to do certain things. You can't do everything, and I think we've Allison says this, ESG needs to, well, we need to have an adult conversation. We need to sort of understand that you can't do it, all. There's the just because you can't just
Yeah.
do ESG, you can't just operationalize ESG. You've got to
No,
choose, you've got to make tough decisions, and that's a strategic exercise. It's not a marketing exercise, it's not a compliance exercise, it's a strategic exercise. So what you're saying, I think, really aligns with that. And I think that some of these tools and techniques really help us, but I'm not so sure that everyone sees it in the same way. So I'm just wondering how you mentioned this, you alluded to this, but I'm just wondering how others maybe see this, where the sort of the evolution of some of the stuff is. And you've seen this stuff on the ground too, right? In inside organizations where there are trade-offs to be made.
absolutely. And I think that term trade-offs is a good one, because let's say a company will want to reduce their emissions, or be told they have to reduce their emissions, and that's
Mm,
across sector, cross companies, and but they have to then be told, okay, well then we have to sacrifice the profits and the payout of the dividends to the shareholders,
mm,
and that's going to hurt. It'll hurt for a little while. And then the falling dividends may mean a falling share price. And that can hurt on the returns. It can hurt on the fact that some employees and particularly executive levels they're part of their pay package is comes from
Mm.
shares. And
Mm.
so there's that whole
Yeah.
sort of, and then there's the whole society thing of, okay, that can affect my savings, that could affect my children's
Mhm.
education. So there's that
Mhm.
trade-off there. But then there's also the trade-off where there's just multiple interests. And that's where a company, especially when you're working with stakeholders, is that
Mhm.
managing of the expectations. Not every stakeholder is going to be part of the decision making process. That's where they have to understand maybe this is where they influence. And that's where
Mhm.
transparent communication has to take place. Because so often companies and governments, they'll go out, they'll do a stakeholder engagement process, and then they'll
Mhm.
disappear. There's no reporting back and being very
Mhm.
clear on what that stakeholder engagement was about, or that the thrust of it, and also
Mhm.
what are the next steps. And those are the decisions of the company, not necessarily the community. And
Mm.
I've also seen where more and more now, especially on the extractive industry side, is
Mhm.
okay, companies and governments have to work closer to much more aligned, close together, and they have to go
Mhm.
out and engage stakeholders together, not
Mhm.
separately, because there can be
Mhm.
different stories that come to place. But also too, I mean, I've also thought about my own decision making process as a
Okay.
professional, and thought, okay, there's a new term I have. It's called COIN. And first of all,
Mhm.
it's finding that common purpose. What is the purpose of of this engagement, whether it's an internal one for a company or whether it's a external one with using the stakeholders or engaging the stakeholders,
Mm.
not using them, pardon me. Um,
Mhm.
and then observations. Go and observe. Let them speak. Don't feel company X that you have to go out and have all the answers up front. Usually you don't. And
Mm.
we learn that
Mhm.
time and time again. They
Mhm.
don't
Mhm.
have, no matter how close they are. And I mean, especially in the extractive industry, it's like, oh, all our community relations officers at site, they live at site, they eat and breathe and play and all of this. And then suddenly something happens. It's like, well, we just didn't know. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like anyone when you live in a community, you don't know everything that's going on. No. So,
Mm.
and then there's the I, the inquiry piece. What works, what might not, what wouldn't work, what
Mhm.
hasn't worked for that community or organization, and then the next steps and being really proactive on those next steps. And I found that
Mhm.
that has actually a better model for me around to use around decision making and or influencing even, because sometimes I have
Mhm.
to step back and think, okay, I'm just going to be influencing. I'm not an influencer like social media, but I'm an influencer in the decision making process. And so I
Mhm.
have a responsibility, of course, to my company I worked for, or even the client who's engaged me, but also to that community to get it
Mm.
correct. And I found that in extractive industries, particularly when I worked in emerging geography areas and in emerging markets, whether that is in the Middle East, and that includes
Mhm.
even Iraq, where
Mhm.
I've had to be very clear and own the space that I work in, and also in Latin America when I've worked there, because not only, I mean, yes, there's a language barrier, but there's also been that whole um, situation, I should say, and it's been rather, traumatic for a lot of a lot of groups. And I've seen it here in Canada with with the First Nations. Companies have gone in, used the community, especially in the extractive industry, used the community, used the land, used everything, and then pulled out because of a investment decision, or there hasn't been proper remediation of both the land and also for the community to help the community, let's say with ancillary um, opportunities in industry, like let's say if there's a mine site, a silver mine site in Guatemala that I
Mm.
worked with,
Mm.
build out the artisanal mining side of it as well, so they can have another
Mhm.
side, I don't want to say side hustle, but it's certainly
Mm.
that could grow and keep the community in place. And there's also to that skill set that can be
Okay.
developed, and what we call it in sustainability is the local content piece, particularly when you're
Mm.
working in emerging markets. Now, when I was working in the Middle East and in particularly in Iraq, I mean, there was the challenge around, okay, we need to make sure that, okay, on this side, company X, as we expand our operation, that we bring the community in and we provide jobs, training for these jobs, whether it's welding, whether it's no more administrative work. And that's very important. And then also too, and having worked in large industrial sites, and also, yeah, I've worked in ports as well, working closely with the general manager at that operation site, because he or she has insights that none of us
Mm,
have in a corporate
mm,
area or at a community level. They work with this, they oversee the entire operation. They are the eyes and ears of the operation. So I'm not saying what they say goes, but they certainly have a different mandate, and that is operating the site, but also that piece of, okay, they also have that opportunity to influence in a way that someone from a corporate environment or a
mhm.
consulting environment doesn't have. Yet they can be very challenging because sometimes they don't want to meet with people. They're like, I'm too busy running the site. Yeah.
Right. So I'd like to I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this in this area generally. I want to zoom into some of the roles that you've had, these
Okay.
roles, particularly in these challenging environments. You mentioned Iraq, you mentioned Latin America, and then afterwards I want to zoom out. But I want to spend a little bit of time because most of my listeners will not even maybe even know that these types of roles exist in the first place. And I want
Right.
to just, it'd be useful if you just maybe paint a picture of the context of what are these roles all about? What does that job look like? You mentioned spending time at kitchen tables, and how does that come about? Just to give a flavor of what's involved, and then how does the company how do you get involved in or otherwise in the company's own decision making around what they're doing? So just be useful just to paint a picture. What are these what are these types of roles? What are you talking about? What's if you give it maybe an example of what yeah, what's the job? What's the job description? What are you meant to be doing? What does that look like? What are your day to day? What does it the day to day or the week to week look like? That would be maybe a useful place to start.
Okay. How I came into these roles. Well,
Mhm.
I think what I had initially was a very good base when I started my career here in Canada. So that's where, I started. And, even in Canada, which is a very democratic society,
Mhm.
we have emerging issues, challenges when we lead the way, we're told, in reconciliation with our First Nations. So I've worked with some tough stakeholder groups. That's where I
Mm,
started. And that's where I started here in Canada, was some really tough stakeholder groups on some tough issues where, let's say, okay, the forestry sector is decimated.
mm,
When I started working in the late or mid 90s to late 90s, the issue that I started out with was mountain pine beetle. The mountain pine beetle,
mhm,
and this is nature. Nature's also destructive as well.
mhm,
Had decimated forests, large swaths of the forest here in British Columbia, and the forestry industry was on its way out in some respects, and it was, throwing its hands up in the air with the government saying, "What do we do? What do we do?" And this is where the government had to come in
mm,
and think, okay, we're going to start looking at community economic development and how we not only just make community investment into communities, but we also have to build communities, and not just physically build them, but build them up again. Because so many places in Canada have been industry towns, and once
mm,
the mine goes, once the forest, something happens, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, it can have repercussions for the community and for people's lives. So that's where I started. So I had a really good grounding in what's probably known as issue management. So I was looking at, okay, issues such as healthcare, education, local content, how to engage people in getting new jobs. And sometimes people in Canada, they didn't want a new job. They didn't want to start training again at 60 for a new job. Um, yeah. So that's where it started. And then in the geography side, well, I worked for two global consulting companies. And one of them I think we shared as an employer, but at different times, and that was ERM. And ERM took me out to the Middle East initially, and that's where I got to work in some really different environments beyond the Gulf Arab countries. I was able to work in Egypt and in Iraq and in Turkey. And again, it was, and I always say to people, it was the extractive industries because
Hmm.
people often think that, oh, they're not held to account. It's like, no, they're held to a higher account in some respects because
Right.
they come in, they have to become not only the economic driver in a
Mm.
community, but also for the country. And that need to, okay, we now have to work with governments to ensure that when we are operating, whether it's building or, at a later stage operating, how we can manage those expectations. And of course, the government is a stakeholder, but it can be a partner as well. And sometimes one oil and gas company that I consulted with in the Middle East, they started out as a private company and they were held by a family actually. Then they moved into being what is a national oil company. And then they moved into being owned by an international oil company. So there's always that interesting opportunity around the transaction piece. And that's been very key in my professional journey is, okay, where can sustainability be in this transaction? It
Hmm.
can't just be a feel good piece.
Hmm.
There is also what I sometimes call the good, the bad, and the ugly. And sometimes the good is the transaction. And that's helpful. And then in Latin America, again, I mean, I've worked in Guatemala, and I worked in the mining industry, and that was many years ago, and that was helping them, figure out, okay, how do we work with communities? You know,
Hmm.
how do we, make sure that we get our information out? Yes, we can hire locals to be our community relations or liaison officers, but
Hmm.
what if they don't understand what we do?
Hmm.
So it was almost like being a train the trainer role, that one. And that's been sometimes a role that I've had to take on is train the actual trainer, not be
Hmm.
the front person, be the person who is going to train the people up
Hmm.
to be the leader, the community leader for that or voice for that
So,
industry.
would you say these are like communications roles? That this is about going into the community and explaining, communicating what the company is doing, and or is that also about trying to understand where the communities are coming from? And you mentioned spending some time at kitchen tables. What are you doing? What are you doing at
Okay,
the
yeah.
kitchen table?
All right, I did bring up the kitchen table. Well, that's yeah. It was interesting because a role that I had from about 10 years ago was with Qatar Energy, and that's
Mm.
the national oil company of Qatar. And Qatar has the largest LNG, liquefied natural gas deposit in the world. They are a leader, and it's amazing that it was all in Qatar. Now, Qatar Energy has diversified now. They do have operation sites in other places in the world. But at that time, 10 years ago when I worked for them, they didn't. And I would go off to what was Qatar is a small country as well. I'd go off to the northern part of the peninsula because Qatar is located on a peninsula, and that's where the Bedouin communities were. And the Bedouin are very revered and they're very knowledgeable. They have remained very grounded, no pun intended, in the land that they operate on and or live on. And then, of course, they were open to Qatar Energy because it's the national oil company, but at the same time, they wanted a stake. And kitchen tables, I may not have gone to a kitchen table, but I go to a modulist, and the modulist is where people meet, and it's usually segregated because that is the custom of that culture. And what I would do is usually on a Friday morning, um, being in the Islamic faith, that's the most important time to pray. I would go to the majlis, the gathering, and I would speak to women and hear what they had to say about the project.
Mm-hmm.
And normally what they would say is they want education opportunities, sometimes for themselves, but
Mm-hmm.
more so for their children. How do we ensure, yes, we're okay with the operation site being built here or being further developed, but what are we playing in this? Because we are the stewards, and that's another key word in sustainability and ESG is
Mm-hmm.
okay. How can we be the best steward? Whether it's being more of a influencer, an actual decision maker or leader in a decision, or how do we bring other people into that decision making process? So really, the going to the kitchen table, and I've done this in many places, especially in Latin America, because the table is very important, la mesa,
Mhm.
and coming together and meeting many people within that family, and it's listening. And that's where I think, on a comms communication side, yes, I think, as a sustainability ESG practitioner, yes, I'm a communicator, but I'm also a lot more. I'm a liaison,
Yeah.
I'm an advocate, I'm a resistance manager. I've done that. I've
Hmm.
had to do a lot of that because a lot of times, especially when I've been at the kitchen table talking to stakeholder groups or in a community office for a site, they think, okay, the stakeholder, I've come in, I've told you what I want, I filled out that
Hmm.
form, and it's going to happen.
Hmm.
It doesn't.
Hmm.
It has to go through a decision making process. Sometimes that's where it's the information shared piece. And that's where I have to sometimes I have to be sitting there at the kitchen table and saying,
Hmm.
what am I going to be? Am I going to be a communications person? Am I going to be an advocate? Am I going to be, you know, a resolver of a problem? But, I have to be very clear on what it is my role is and what the company information wise wants at this point in time.
And what do you do with that information? Or I suppose it varies, but are there also potentially some internal challenges associated with you might be hearing some things from communities that might have a impact on the company, or it might challenge its values, or it might, I don't know, I've worked in security with security colleagues before, and there's quite a connection between community acceptance and security issues.
Yeah.
So listening is really, really important, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your colleagues are taking what you're saying
No,
seriously, or
exactly.
maybe it challenges some of their incentives, or it's similarly internally, it can be quite messy, right?
It can be. And sometimes it is like, okay, they see it, individuals in the company see it as, okay, a checklist. We did that. We
Hmm.
listened, but we didn't promise anything. And
Hmm.
that's always a bit of a thorn in the side.
Hmm.
That's why on my side, when I take the information back, whether I'm a consultant or internally, I try to capture it really correctly. So
Hmm.
I do sometimes have versions that I do of things. I often am not by myself. I do bring a colleague with me,
Hmm.
especially if it's a community liaison officer at the site, because they're going to deal with it the aftermath.
Hmm.
Um, and that's very key is to have them there. And sometimes especially when I was working in the Middle East in Qatar, I had to have a Qatari with me, not only for the language side, but also the social customs of how to enter a modulus, how to enter a home, because it's very different to the Western world. There are separate entrances for men and women. And
Hmm.
people would say to me after the fact, especially in Canada, how was that? That must have been really
Hmm.
degrading. I'm like, no, I don't think of it that way. I just think of it as
Hmm.
it was a way for me to facilitate doing that engagement in the best manner and most empowering manner, pardon me, for that stakeholder group,
Hmm.
um, to respect their customs. So what I try to do, like I said, I try to capture it properly, then I clarify. So if there's a point that needs to be clarified, I either speak to my colleague who I went with, or
Hmm.
I speak to, let's say, the general manager at the site. I heard this. Give me a little bit more information on that. Um, Also, too, okay, there's sometimes other people in the company that are speaking, my colleagues speaking to that community. What is
Hmm.
your take on this? Can you round this one out? Because sometimes it is, especially working with stakeholders, it's their feelings that come in because they're humans.
Hmm.
Yeah. And we interpret things from our very human, individual human identities.
Hmm.
And then organizing the information, and that usually is where Excel spreadsheets come into play. There are stakeholder relations platforms that are out there. I won't plug any of them in this call, but there's loads of them out there, and they can be very useful for historic information. And it's really good when, especially when I've, as a consultant, been parachuted into a project and need to get a quick read on the situation and or who's who in the zoo, as we say,
Mm-hmm.
and then review and then go out and further engage. And that is that reiteration process that's very important, that engagement piece, because once so many stakeholders have said, and I've heard this in Canada and in other parts of the world, the company came out and spoke to us and told us how important we were as a stakeholder, but we never heard from them again. And we had to go and fill out a form to have somebody come and speak to us again. And the person, and this has been sort of one of the things, especially when I worked as a consultant. And then they sent you, and you don't even work for the company. You're a consultant,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be very disheartening
Mm.
for a stakeholder. But on the
Yeah.
industry
Yeah.
side, I mean, there's stakeholders there, and that's where the supply chain comes into play. And that's very important as well. There's all of the issues that are raised from stakeholders in that supply chain. And that's particularly true. And I think I haven't raised this is the health, safety, and environment piece,
Mm-hmm.
HSE and C, which is the community. And that
Mm-hmm.
was when I started my career early in the 90s, where a lot of us started. I mean, I started on the community side, but a lot of people started, and it was health and safety because a site, and whether it's a garment industry company or it's a oil and gas company, if there isn't health and safety, they don't operate. And we've seen it in Canada where certain companies that are operating in extractive industries, they've been shut down for periods of
Mm-hmm.
time because they had the health and safety issues have not been
Mm-hmm.
adhered to. So
Mm-hmm.
there is that as well. And that can be brought into the stakeholder piece of the
Yeah.
conversation because the community can say, look, you're flaring in our community,
Mm-hmm.
yet, and you said it was going to be safe, but here we
Mm.
are 2 weeks into our first flare, and
Mm-hmm.
there's molecules in the air. You said there wasn't going to be any.
Yeah. Have you had situations maybe like this, like the one you just mentioned, where you're hearing something from local community members and you bring it back and that has implications on something the company wants to do and your internal colleagues are not happy about that? They just like, what do you mean? We need the construction to start next week, or we need whatever this thing to happen. So we've got to make. Have you been in situations where there's that sort of internal tension between community expectations, perceptions, and the commercial or operational realities? And what does that look like? And how do you navigate that?
Yes, all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
going to
What?
say
Yeah.
this,
Mm-hmm.
having worked more on the social side in recent years.
Sure.
I've even had
Yeah.
conflicts with my environmental colleagues as well, where we sit and
Right.
we're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
are we working
Mm-hmm.
for the same company? Are we working with
Mm-hmm.
the same
Right.
stakeholders?
Right.
So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So no, I've definitely heard that. And that's where, the internal engagement piece is very important. And, platforms, I don't like to say that they're the be all and end all, but they do help. But as a sustainability practitioner who's worked on both sides of the environmental and on the on the social side, and working more recently with board directors around ESG issues, especially around that governance pieces. Okay, this is where the code of practice comes into play, where
Mm-hmm.
we do shared what we've called community agreements, and that's where it really is a coming together, almost like a project charter. Not coming from
Okay.
my uh, consulting background is okay. Maybe now, yes, we have those with our external stakeholders, but we need to have those with our internal stakeholders as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where good project management comes into play, but also
Mm-hmm.
good quality management as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always the challenge of okay, I'm working on project. Let's say it's a regulator letter for
Mm-hmm.
a an issue that was raised by a stakeholder, and the regulator has come back and said, okay, company X, we want you to raise this issue. Tell us about it. Tell us about the how,
Mm-hmm.
but tell us the why, but also give us a current state. So I can go and let's say speak to, let's say there's an issue in the community and it's flaring and it's oh, community members are concerned about children and asthma
Mhm.
because of air quality. And I can then go to my environmental colleagues and say, okay, well,
Mhm.
what did we do around this issue? What's what is our
Mhm.
North Star? How are we going to operate around and address this? And they can come back with something, some
Mhm.
policies, procedures, next account,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. But on the social side, that's when I have to say, okay, we have to be more
Yeah.
transparent.
Right.
That's where humans, and that's where often found with my colleagues.
Mm.
Um, and I'm just saying the environmental ones. I've worked with some amazing environmental colleagues who are very transparent and accountable. I don't want to, but I have had
Mm.
challenges with that where it's like it's almost like they've withheld information or the fact that they are not keen for it to be fully distributed, even though we've committed to that. And that's where I've had to come together with my colleagues and say, okay, how do we best communicate this to sometimes it's community members, sometimes it can even
Mhm.
be to shareholders then. Because it's almost like the cake is half baked. We need to, flare a little
Mhm.
bit more. We're still in a testing site,
Mhm.
and that has been communicated to the stakeholders or the community
Mhm.
members. They know that, but it's just that
Mhm.
initial shock, or not shock, I should say,
Right.
surprise. There's that
Well,
learning as you go
also,
piece.
as you're talking about that, I'm thinking, trust is a huge issue, right? So you can say, oh,
Yeah,
you can communicate something scientifically and say, there's no risk to your children or something like this, but they may not believe you. And if they don't believe you, and if there are other factors, the local, the intelligence around the social dynamics locally, that could escalate. It could turn into all types of things, protests or other local opposition, or just if there's a lack of trust, that can become a huge problem. And if you've got internal stakeholders that are trying to simply communicate something scientifically, and they're not really understanding the dynamics and what that could lead to, then you've got a problem. It's a very complicated and complex role to play. And then, the external, right? If you've got shareholders who are way out in some other part of the world, who are just expecting that, I don't know, construction is going to finish on this date and first oil is going to happen on that date, and you're telling
yeah,
them, actually, you've got to deal with this local community problem, or and that will delay things, I don't know, by a certain amount, or it might even, or it could backfire if you don't do this properly. It's a very challenging role, right? And that's where the decision making piece and the trade-offs and the really understanding what is, the intelligence, really framing decisions really well, I would have thought, is an incredibly important skill in those contexts, right?
exactly. No, and I think that's where a lot of, I mean, there, having worked in, in the energy sector,
Mm-hmm.
scenario planning is very important, but now they're looking at, okay, how can we all work collaboratively to make better decisions? And that's what brought me to you, because
Mm-hmm.
I want to learn to make better decisions. And sometimes there is this, this need to go um, and do a lot of academic work around it, when sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it is a simple framework that needs to be in place,
Mm-hmm.
and a simple framework that, yes, I can learn and I can take that out to the communities that I work with, or even into a boardroom, because so often there's conversation, dialogue, very important, but there's no structure around it. And so a decision can't
Yeah.
be made, or a decision or it can be misinterpreted
Yeah.
and think that a decision has been made. And I don't want to say that,
Mm-hmm.
I have had information withheld from me and I've had to dig really deep for it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I wasn't asking the right questions or framing the
Mm-hmm.
question particularly well. Or there is such a pressurized environment that it's sort of just give me an answer so I can just, it's an answer for now that I can provide to, in my last example, regulator X, and we can keep building on it later. And that's important. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong in a decision making
It,
process. Sometimes it can't be a final, and it has to be a live decision making process, dynamic, But at the same time, it's almost like, okay, am I going to have to backtrack then?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, one of the things this is also why I've drifted towards my career towards decision making, is because you're talking to different constituents, different stakeholders. Stakeholders, local community members use a different, they have a different language. Even if you're doing this project in Canada, and everyone speaks English or French or one of the,
Yeah.
uh,
Or the growing, I mean, there's a
or
growing,
indigenous language or something, right? But it's not the same. It's even though it's not the same language as a shareholder's language or a board's language or an engineering language, and sometimes all these standards and frameworks and things can almost get in the way because you're talking about different. You're not talking the same language, right? And so sometimes I think just having the common unit of measure of discussion just being a decision, right? People can better understand what that means. But even then, I think you mentioned the thing about trust. Like, how do you? I've been having this conversation this week around measurement and how do you measure trust? Like, if your local community does not trust you as an entity, then as a company, then that's really difficult to move
turn the
forward,
ship around.
and that to turn the ship around, but then how do you measure trust to, how do you communicate that to engineering and finance people, right? It's a challenge. It's a very complicated, very, very complex area. Very interesting,
And I mean, I
but
found
complex.
especially working in developing countries and
Mm-hmm.
emerging markets, go to them. They're
Mm-hmm.
not, yeah, go to them.
Mm-hmm.
Make the trip to the site. Spend more than an overnight at the site. Spend a whole week at the
Mm-hmm.
site. Uh, that's very
Yeah.
important as well.
Yeah.
Go to
Yeah.
them. Don't
Mm-hmm.
and don't and yes, video calls are great, and I'm really
Right.
enjoying this.
Right. Right.
But they only get
Yeah.
you, even then, they only get you so
Yeah.
far, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of people, they don't want to say something if it's especially with stakeholders, if it's being
Mm.
recorded or they can't be on a video call.
Mm.
They're like,
Mm.
I could go, hey, I could meet you at the local Tim Hortons and have a conversation there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, I've even had
Mm-hmm.
that. It's like I
Mm-hmm.
can't do it on video. I don't want to do it
Yeah.
over the phone. Let's just if I can could you meet me? And that's the importance of meeting people where they are. It's also as well being visible and being visible in places
Mm-hmm.
that aren't necessarily where um, stakeholders would think you'd be. I
Mm-hmm.
worked for a president of an oil company here in Canada, and he was very good at going out in the evening, so leaving site
Mm-hmm.
and not just staying on site and staying with his group at site or going into his room and doing that. He would go to the local grocery store and the local Shoppers Drug Mart, which is like the equivalent in the UK of Boots, and he would be Christmas shopping in July, but he'd be talking to everybody there, and his joke was, I've got to get my Christmas shopping done early. And I always thought that
Okay.
was ingenious
Mm-hmm.
because it was like, yeah, he went to people and he went, to a place where, okay, everyone can go and he'll
Mm-hmm.
meet a wide variety of people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes these are people who are not associated with the site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also too, and I think something that we not talked about is stakeholder engagement. We also really need to look at, okay, with stakeholders being realistic, it's almost like you have to prioritize them. So there's stakeholder group one,
Mm-hmm.
grouping one, maybe six of those, grouping two, grouping three. And that's where, there are models that also come into play. And, there is the international public participation model, which is one that I think is very good. I would uh, encourage your readers or listeners to have a look at that because that is helpful at looking at the continuation of
Mm-hmm.
stakeholder engagement. They call it public participation because they don't see it as something that should be too exclusionary. And
Mm-hmm.
stakeholders sometimes can have an exclusionary element to it, especially when they're being prioritized, which happens everywhere. You have your A
Mm.
list, your B list, and your C list.
As you were
So,
saying that, I was remembering a former colleague who also works at one of these large companies, and his I don't think it was him. It was a colleague of his was at one of these community consultation things, and he gave, I don't know who it was, a state, community member or something, his business card, and the business card said stakeholder risk management on it. And so you've got a recipient who says, "Oh, so I'm a risk, am I?" And it just made it a little awkward. So there
Yeah,
are all these lessons. I really like the point about spending some time and understanding the context. I think that's so valuable
exactly. And
in
being
so many
very
ways, right?
and being very clear up front, as a person who works in stakeholder relations, saying, okay, the company is here for information out right now,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
we will take, there will, and we need some information in, being very clear
Mm-hmm.
about what it is, because to say we're going to have a stakeholder engagement session, that's just like a circus, at
Right.
the best of, at the worst times, or the
Right.
best, maybe not
Right.
the best of times, I don't know, but I've seen that where that's happened, and it's just like, okay, or we're gonna do a town hall, the company
Mm.
says. Well, make
Mm.
sure you've got restrictions on that. Just understanding, okay, are we here just to inform, or are we going to really empower this community? But if we're
Mm.
dare to just inform, don't bring up too much around empowerment at that stage, because that is an incredible long journey. And especially in
Okay.
infrastructure and extractive industry companies, that can be 10 to 15 years, that journey.
Mm. It's
With
so
lots of
it's so
bumps
nuanced.
on
There's
the
a
road.
lot, yeah, and a lot of it's
Yeah.
behavioral. I think is what's said, what's not said. Even the mere presence of a company raises all sorts of expectations that may not be easily captured. Messages may be misinterpreted. It's really fascinating, but very very complex. I did want. I'm just conscious of time, but also just I wanted to zoom out a little bit too. And
Okay.
you mentioned, so we talked a lot about extractives industries, the oil and gas sector, and I probably got some listeners now who are saying, we're talking about sustainability and ESG and everything. We're talking about some of the dirtiest industries in the world, and they'd be right. But at the same time, a lot of these firms have learned a lot and have got some good practices, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we're on the on the road towards some huge climate impacts. And I'm just wondering if you maybe we could zoom out and just maybe understand the role of where all of this has been and is going, in terms of, I mean, is it having any sort of impact on the climate, on climate change mitigation, on where is this going, and how much should we expect that companies are going to play their role here versus governments. So not just a
Uh,
little easy question to dive into, but just curious, is this making a
that's
difference, right?
okay.
Is
So
this making a difference, I guess, overall, right?
That's where the adaptation versus mitigation piece comes into play with climate change. And that's where companies have to decide where they are. Some companies can take the role of being a mitigator, some can take the role of being an adapter. And I'm probably not the right person to ask that question. There,
Okay.
you need a climate change strategist to
Okay.
answer that. But
Mhm.
from my understanding, it's deciding what you're on, being very aware of compliance and regulation in the countries that one operates in as a company,
Mhm.
very important. Understanding if you're operating in a community, okay, what have been some of the community issues that have happened and that have taken place? Has a volcano been erupted or something like that, or
Mhm.
has there been a mass, degradation of the land, or has this land been used for something else? To be that awareness piece um, for to understand climate change, and then working with governments more and understanding,
Mhm.
okay, this may not be a solution, but an
Mhm.
adaptive behavior is very important.
Mhm.
Understanding
Mhm.
how, not only as individuals we need to adapt, but also as companies how we need to adapt. And understanding, okay, we've all got an understanding in companies pretty much about, okay, we know what our scope one greenhouse gas emissions are,
Mhm.
what our scope two are, but what are our scope three? And how can we better report on those? or collect the data for those. So there is that. I mean, I know frameworks and compliance and policy can be really nauseating, but that's where a company has to come into play and think, okay, greenhouse gas work emissions, it can't be done on the side of our desk. And I've seen this more and more
Mm-hmm.
with extractive industry companies, whether it's mining or oil and gas or forestry. We need to have a person in place who just is dealing with the greenhouse gas accounting and reporting piece,
Mm-hmm.
and has to be just honed in on how to not only report, but also how to raise a discussion, and how to even train executives and board directors on understanding climate strategy, not just sustainability strategy, climate strategy, very
Mm-hmm.
bespoke. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where I've seen things headed.
Okay. So I was just going to say that that's very useful, because that's just having an ESG strategy is not a climate strategy, right? So it's really important to use the language appropriately, and that sits somewhere in the E part, but that's not just doing, again, it's kind of impossible just to do ESG as a blanket thing. There's all types of
No,
nuance to it. Mm-hmm.
exactly. And then, realizing climate change is going to affect, and this is where the trade off is going to affect
Mm-hmm.
future generations. And it's already affecting, you know, with weather patterns, people and what they can do. I mean, up in the Arctic, I mean, it's not as frozen as it used to be. Canadian winters are not as cold
Right.
as they used to be.
Right.
The Rideau Canal, which is a UNESCO heritage site in Ottawa, which I know you know very well, didn't operate last year because it didn't freeze enough. So there was a safety issue. People couldn't go
Mm.
ice skating on it. So, and that's a huge shift for the economics of a community as well, because there were small businesses in Ottawa who
Yep.
relied on, on the canal being frozen. And that has been attributed to, okay, we're getting warmer summers and warmer
Mm.
winters, wetter winters. And that's where in British Columbia, where I live in Canada, where we're challenged, because it's like, okay, mudslides,
Mm.
um, raging forest fires, um, and all over, going from California up to British Columbia. And that's having a detrimental effect on communities, and whether they're urban or rural. But
Mm.
there's also, just getting back to your point around climate changes, the, the issue of climate change is it's becoming more and more apparent that companies, industries, sectors, they have to work with government at all levels. They can't be like, okay, we're just going to do our greenhouse gas emission scope 1, scope 2. That's good enough. It's a starting place, but you've been doing that company X, and this is where government has to
Mm-hmm.
come in and play. Company X or sector X, industry X. Yeah, you've been doing that for 12 years now, 15 years. That's not enough now.
Mm.
You now have to start looking at a much greater um, scope of work. And climate change is the biggest issue in ESG. And I think I've waited too long to say that in this podcast, but I
Mm.
think it's an important one to notice, because it's just going to affect so much on a human scale, and the understanding around how
Mm-hmm.
to build good governance around that, and then that's
Mm.
where good decision making comes into play.
Yeah. And that's even, more where there'll be tougher choices to be made. You mentioned AI at the start as well. I came across and there was something that came out I think it was just this week, about how AI is much better at predicting weather weather patterns than how it's traditionally been done, which I find really interesting, because AI increasingly has a environmental impact, a climate impact, the use of AI and all, this is all interconnected. So I found it slightly ironic. At the same time, we're perhaps not talking about the interconnectivity of AI and climate, and where
Absolutely, and that's where
this will
I
all
think the
go.
important issue of the
Mm,
energy transition. And that's where AI and
mm,
climate change both are big topics in,
mm,
okay, we want to use renewable energy. We want to engage in that. Well, renewable energy can be an energy suck in some respects. It also can be very degrade the environment that they operate
mm,
in, because they're not always maintained. Let's say a wind farm. I've
Yeah.
seen that where they haven't been maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're just put in a place, a wind farm or a solar, and there hasn't been a proper environmental impact assessment done.
Mm-hmm.
So it might not be the right renewable energy for that area,
Right.
geographic area that is. And then also too, I mean, we still need to mine critical minerals to build
Mm-hmm.
renewable energy products, to
Mm-hmm.
build phones that we love, the smart ones
Mm.
that is, and for these electric vehicles, we need critical minerals, meaning we still need to
Mm-hmm.
mine.
Yeah. Yeah. This is why trade-offs and tough decisions. This is why we need to have these adult conversations, because otherwise we're not going to get through this stuff. This is really
Exactly.
valuable. We covered an awful lot of ground, Isabel, but I'm just wondering if there was anything that we didn't get a chance to cover that you wanted to mention.
Well, I think we covered so much, but I know that ESG can sound like alphabet soup, and it's really
Mm,
overwhelming. And com- companies now are thinking, well, hold it, I'm a multinational or even a mid-sized
mm,
multinational company. And they're
mm,
thinking, oh my goodness, I've got so much reporting to do. That's
mm,
not ESG. ESG is
right.
very strategic. And don't get bogged down with the reporting, the alphabet soup. Of course, the regulation side is very important, but there is that need now. Okay,
Mm,
start small. It doesn't have to be big. And if a
okay.
company comes to me, and I use this example more often than not, and they come to me and they have 100 or 70-page sustainability report, I think, okay, they need a lot of help.
Mm,
It's actually being more nimble that's important in sustainability and in particular ESG now,
mm,
because there is that whole need to, of course, go further, go faster, but you got to go fairer as
mm.
well. And information overload now is not what stakeholders want to
No,
see. They want to
no.
see a really clear communication piece, and they really want to see, and this is very important, how they can be engaged in the future. So, what is the
Mm,
future plan? No more box checking. No more one shot or splash in the pan. They
mm,
really want to see, okay, how are we helping you on this journey?
mm,
And that's very key too. And that's where
mm,
I understand the decision making process, particularly the model that you advocate. The focus is very important because it can show the longevity of that relationship with a stakeholder, whether it's in a supply chain, because that's other industries more often than not,
mm,
whether it's a physical community, whether it's a community with with working with colleagues as well. There is that the decision making process is key, but also
mm,
it's that relationship building process that's key. So
mhm,
if it has to be storming, norming, and forming, fine. But I do think that the decision making tool focus model is an excellent one. And like I said, I've come up with my own as well. The one that I
mm,
said about coin. I've even have one that I think, and it's much more near and dear to my heart, and it's called Dear. And what I think of
mm,
is, it's okay. Maybe I have to detach a bit from my decision, or the process that I'm in, or the situation I find myself in, not from the
mm,
decision. So detach, then I have to have empathy, and then I have to ask questions. And then maybe, most important thing is to reframe it.
mm.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, that's useful, really useful, and probably a good place to wrap things up. But finally, for people that have enjoyed listening to you and want to connect and follow you and all of that good stuff, where can they do that?
They can do that through LinkedIn. I'm Isabel Alice O'Connell, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm a fairly active LinkedIn member. So please just drop me a LinkedIn connection request. And if you can drop me a note as well with it, that really helps as well, because then I have some context. Because I do get a lot of, as we all do nowadays, so many connection requests, and I sometimes
Yeah,
just don't have time to sort
and
of try to figure out where I've met this
sure.
person or engaged with the person
Yeah.
in the spider web that we call life.
Great, Isabel. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
No, thank you, Ben.
You too.
It's
Thank
been a
you very
pleasure.
much.